Bonjour. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Very happy to be at the Paris Peace Forum. Sarah, thank you very much for being with us this morning. Sarah Wayne Callis is not only a very famous star that you all have seen in series and movies and shows such as The Walking Dead or Breaking Bad, but no, sorry, Prison Break.
I just got a promotion.
Yes. But you're also an ambassador for the International Rescue Committee for more than 10 years now. I know that there is personal reason in your own family story for you joining the IRC, an organization which is supporting refugees and displaced persons. Maybe you can tell us how you decided to join the IRC.
Sure. Good morning, Harlem. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the Paris Peace Forum for giving us an opportunity to speak on these things today. I started working with the IRC because my grandfather was a refugee. He left what was then Hungary and what is now Romania in 1920. And moved to the US, and he started at 8 years old selling apples on the street in New York. And by the time he passed away, he was running Fred Astaire dance studios in Chicago for Fred Astaire. So it was not an easy landing for him because IRC was founded in 1933, and there weren't the kind of aid organizations to sort of welcome refugees that there are today. And so I wanted to be a part of that welcoming process.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for supporting us. And since these past 10 years, you've been visiting a lot of our programs at the border of Myanmar, in Thailand, in Iraq, in Jordan, in Serbia. And you've been speaking with the refugees, with the people we support, the people we help to survive, to recover, to regain control of their future, and with our teams. What struck you the most about this discussion that you could have with the refugees, the client of the IRC, and our teams?
You know, the impression I always come away with is one of being overwhelmed by the generosity that I see, both in the refugees that we serve and in the people who do the serving. For instance, when I was in Domi's camp in northern Iraq in Kurdistan in 2013, we're with a Syrian refugee population that's lost everything, right? I mean, they're grieving the loss of their homes and their communities and their stability and the world that they've always known. And yet everyone I spoke to would invite me into their tent for tea or an orange, whatever they had. They were there to offer gratitude for the services they were receiving and to give whatever they had. And I think that's a remarkable instinct. And it's one that refugee communities that I've seen resettled in the United States and elsewhere, again, bring with them this sense of gratitude and of wanting to give and contribute to the community and the economy. And then on the other side of that, there's the people who are doing the serving. There was a young man I met in Belgrade a few years later, and he was with one of the organizations that IRC had partnered with and was supporting. And he himself had been a refugee during the fall of the Balkans, during the Balkan War. And it left an impression on him. And when he was just a university student, you know, poor, living in a flat with, you know, 5 other students going to school, he was taking his bike and under a bridge one day, and there was a Syrian family living under the bridge. And he stopped and he said, "Why are you here?" And they said, "Well, this is our situation. We have no place else to be." He said, "Come with me." And he put them on his floor for the night. He called his friends. He found beds for them to sleep in and couches among people who had very little themselves. And I think it's remarkable how sometimes it's the people who have the least materially to give who give the most on both sides of this coin. It's very generous, and it's instructive for the rest of us, I think.
Yes, you're right. That's always very impressive. And we say at the IRC, when people ask us, how do you keep hope? It's just because of action, because we are acting with the refugees, with our teams. And I mean, when you think of the challenge, you're despaired. When you look at the people and you meet them, then you regain hope. And yeah, it's a trauma to be in this situation. People don't leave their their home just because they want to come to Europe or to the US. By the way, 80% of displaced people in the world are in low and middle income countries. And of course, the driver of this is a crisis, a conflict. You've mentioned Syria refugees on the Balkan road, for example, that you've met. But we see also now the impact of climate change, and that's one of the topics we want to discuss today. There is an addition of conflict. We've seen it just in the past years. Now we have a war in Gaza. We had the war in Armenia just a few weeks, a few months ago. In addition to the war in Ukraine, none of the previous conflicts are stopping because there is a new one. There's more than 50 ongoing conflicts. A lot of them are even not with state, but with diverse armed groups in different places. It's even more difficult than before to have any kind of peace agreement, of diplomatic space, of settling ceasefire or cessation of hostility. And we see the increasing of the number of people. There were, at the end of 2022, there were 108 million displaced people in the world, which was a record high, in particular because of the refugees coming from Ukraine. At the end of September 2023, it's 114 million people. And there was some report which was published a few days or weeks ago by the Peace Institute on the impact of climate change, which says that from now to 2050, it could be 1 billion people who will be displaced because of climate change if there is no support, especially for the more fragile context. And that's what we see also, is that the places where climate change has an impact everywhere, but where it has the most impact is in particular in these crisis-affected places. It's also where less money, less support is going. It's easier for Development Bank, World Bank to work with states, with stable ones, than to work with places and communities where there is not that kind of stability. And we have the direct impact of climate change, which come in addition to conflicts themselves, destroying livelihood with extreme weather events, moving people from their home, increasing the conflict, for example, for accessing scarce resources, arable land, water. But we also have less support to this community. And so, Sarah, what do you think are, so we see the drivers, we see the combination of conflict and climate change. What do you think should be the response or the way to approach this situation?
That's a big question. You know, I think one of the things that I remember, we were talking about this earlier, often these communities that are the most affected by climate change are also the ones who've done the least to contribute to it. So there's a double inequity there. You know, I think the world has an opportunity with COP28 coming up to really start to involve displaced people and refugees in the conversation about climate change, and to recognize that climate change is going to affect these populations in an outsized way, and that's going to require us putting as much effort into accommodating those needs as we put into all of the other efforts around climate change, that refugees really need to be a part of this conversation. You know, and I think if we all learned a tremendous amount from the world's response to the Ukrainian refugee situation. And my hope personally is that what we do is we manage to migrate the compassion that the world had for, to be blunt, white Christian refugees. And we migrate that compassion to the refugees coming from other parts of the world. I think we have an opportunity there to really learn about the vastness of our own compassion and our ability to bring people into our communities in meaningful ways. And hopefully that is something that we can all kind of come on board together as we look ahead to COP28. I do think, and you maybe can speak a little bit about this, some of the solutions, because the problem can be quite big and quite overwhelming. And you know, you were in Nigeria recently, and there are some really exciting tech solutions to some of these environmental and climate-driven challenges. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, absolutely, Sarah. Because you're right, we have to look at the problems, but also the solution. And when I was in Nigeria, that's really a country which illustrates the problem, of course, especially the northern parts. I was in northeast Nigeria, where you have, Boko Haram and other groups who have been attacking several cities and still controlling part of the territories. And so, in addition to very severe climate events like flooding, for example, you have which provoke displacement of population. You have insecurity. It's difficult for people to continue to go to farming and so on. But we have also developed something related to the climate context, which we think is very promising and interesting. But again, you have to find a way to work with local communities and not to rely only on big projects. And it's more about adaptation than about just mitigation. It also, this is also a challenge because nowadays, most of the climate finance is going to mitigation, to reducing the carbon emission, which is fair. But it's only like 1% which is going to the most affected population, which are not emitting. The people in Nigeria, at least this part of the country, in Sahel or in Somalia, where I've been also, their contribution to climate change is like 3% of the total. But there are more than 50% of the people who are exposed to the consequences, to flooding, to droughts, to displacement of population. So we have developed an anticipatory action programs, pilots that we have been testing, which is to ensure that people will be in a situation to be made aware of a climate event before, and that they will receive the support, especially through cash assistance, which is one of the modalities of the humanitarian assistance, before the shock rather than after. And we've been working with meteorological governmental agency, but also with some technological companies to ensure that those data which exists, it is said by experts that, and that's what we think also from our experience, 20% of extreme weather events, they can be predicted days before. So why to wait the people to be, in the worst situation to provide them the assistance, which is the usual and by default way of working now. So we've seen that those groups of the community which receive the support before, they could protect their livestock, their cattle, they could anticipate in terms of the housing, they could avoid to have to sell the few assets there. So that's something we like to promote, including during the COP 28. Germany, for example, has decided to dedicate 5% of its international aid to anticipatory action, while for the rest of the world it's like 1%. I hope that the COP28 will be an opportunity to new commitments from others also to dedicate more to anticipation.
It's exciting. And I think part of one of the things that, like I said, it gets overwhelming, and it's really beautiful to hear about the solutions that exist and that can be developed in partnership, hopefully, with the governments around the world and the civilian sector to try and attack these problems before they become overwhelming. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So, Sarah, thank you very much. We'll be joined now by two other participants to our discussion, where we will speak about also what we can learn from the history of supporting refugees, of welcoming refugees. You've been speaking about your grandfather. That was before the creation of the International Rescue Committee. And I'm very happy that we can now be joined by Anna Winger, who is the creator of the Netflix series Transatlantic, and Ralph Hamusu, who is playing the character Paul, who is both a resistant fighter and an anti-colonialist activist in the series. And this series is about one of the episodes of the creation of the International Rescue Committee. We've been very moved to see it online. It's about the mobilization of what was called at that time the Emergency Rescue Committee, and a small group of people who decided to go to Marseille in the Vichy France in the time of the occupation of a part of France, and to save people, in particular well-known artists and intellectuals, but also thousands of others who were at risk of deportation. And then a journalist, an American journalist, Varian with a group of others, supported by Eleanor Roosevelt, was sent to Marseille to try to get visa to these people. And in the series, it's fascinating because you see Marc Chagall, André Breton, Hannah Arendt, Walter Benjamin, Max Ernst, who have been saved by these people. So what do we learn from the history of generosity, of welcoming, of mobilizing solidarity to welcome refugees in a time where there is so much difficulties to mobilize people? But I mean, this story is telling a lot. And it's not only about what happens 80 years ago. It's about us today. It's about the way we face refugees arriving in our own society. So Anna, maybe first I'd like to ask you, how did you come to the idea to work on this story?
I live in Berlin. And in 2015, when there was the crisis, or when the crisis in Syria kind of prompted a wave of people to come to Germany from that part of the world, everybody I knew, we were all volunteering to help with the refugees who were coming into Berlin. At one point, it was an all hands on deck situation. You know, all normal people were volunteering in camps, taking people, families and individuals into their homes. It was like a huge rescue effort at home, right on my doorstep in Berlin. And I was really struck by the full circle of that, you know, less than a century earlier, people had to leave Berlin as refugees, and now people were coming to Germany to seek safe harbor. And that was really moving to me. And I had heard the story of Varian from my father, who knew some of the individuals involved in the original Emergency Rescue Committee when they were old people in America, and had heard their story of what they did when they were young, this brave history of what they had done. And the thing about the story is that they were just normal people. And I think the thing that's really moving is how much normal people can do to help other normal people. It's something that basic, right? I mean, they were not trained as experts or as spies or as anything really useful. They just said, what can I do to help? And that, I think they were sort of everyday superheroes. And I saw a lot of that in Berlin in 2015 as well. And so I thought this was to go back to this sort of full circle of the story. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very telling story. Ralph, so what interested you the most in your character? It's a very special, I mean, the series is a mix of historical people, like Varian that you just mentioned, and fictional characters, but which refer to real history and also to universal ideas.
Yes, it is. First of all, thank you so much for having us here. It is a pleasure and honor to be invited to speak here. It is sad that we need the IRC so much today. It is very, very sad. I will answer your question in a few points. When I first read the script, I loved Anna's vision. As per making the invisible visible, it was the most striking to me. It was, when you look at the script, when you look at the series, you see an unusual group of people. You see a black person, you see queer people, you see female heroes getting together to become heroes. They are renegades. They, how to say this? They reject the status quo to do something that is bigger than themselves, to help people, to save lives, to save artists, to save refugees. And that to me is heroism, just wanting to help, pretty much. There's that aspect of things. And also the part of Paul is very dear to my heart, because I feel like it was one of the first times that I read a Black African character being involved in World War II. Usually in history books, in TV series, in films, Black people are just erased somehow. But I went to school, like all of you, and I know there were some Buffalo Soldiers, for instance. There were some sharpshooters, and they are often forgotten about. And so thank you so much, Anna, for daring to tell our stories, to give us a voice somehow. So there's that. There's also the fact that it's based on real events. And I love history. And I feel like we should learn so much from what happened in the past, but somehow history keeps repeating itself, and it is sad.
Thank you, Ralph. So during the shooting, the production of the show, which was about history, there was another historical event which broke, which was the war in Ukraine. How did that affect your work, Anna?
Yeah, the war in Ukraine started our second day of production, and I think while we had certainly been inspired by contemporary events or recent events to make the series, we had not anticipated shooting it during another war in Europe. That was extremely horrible and upsetting in every way, of course. We were shooting Walter Benjamin going over the Pyrenees that day, and with a group of extras who were refugees, and it was, they had to do it again and again, as you do in film production. So every time we took a break, everybody was reading on their phones, and it was surreal, actually. Because then we were looking at all the people who were lined up at the border to Poland in their cars, right? And it was terrible, but I think it gave us all a really strong sense of purpose. I mean, in some small way, we're just trying to tell stories that make people think and engage them in the questions of our time. So, yeah.
Yes, Sarah, we are speaking the past days about what it means to welcome the refugee from Ukraine. In addition to the one who were already here before, you mentioned the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015 in Europe, and all the discussion and the ongoing discussion everywhere in Europe about how to deal with the coming of refugees from Africa, from the Middle East. So I know that you live in Canada now, where there's also a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and we've all experienced welcoming Ukrainian refugees also in Europe, in the US. What do you think we should learn from this?
Well, I think, as I say, what we learn, hopefully, from the Ukrainian refugee crisis is that the capacity to welcome those who are suffering into our communities is vast. And that there is a relatively, that the human capacity for depravity is matched by the human capacity for compassion. And, to some extent, the effort and the money and the attention that we put into defense and into arming ourselves and into waging war needs to be matched by our commitment to waging peace and to the humanitarian solutions to these crises. As Ralph pointed out, I think often there is a very big difference between representation of refugees who are white and refugees who are non-white. And so what we've learned is we have this compassion, and we can now extend that to refugees coming from Africa, from the Middle East, from Southeast Asia, from all over the place. And one of the ways in which we hopefully engender compassion like this is through storytelling. There are people who are not going to engage with the refugee issue as a political issue or as a humanitarian issue, but when it's in Netflix and they're looking for something to watch, we have the opportunity as storytellers, I don't know how this is going to translate, good luck everybody who's getting this in French, but to make the broccoli taste like chocolate. We have something to say. It's easier if they're watching on TV sometimes than watching on CNN or Al Jazeera.
Yes, and it's true that the series, also Transatlantic, is about people who have been contributing a lot to the American culture post-wars, because they have been welcomed as refugees. And now we are welcoming Ukrainian refugees, and we have, in Europe in particular, demonstrated that all was said before, we cannot welcome more than, we never said the number, but there was like 1 million Syrian refugees in Germany at the time where Angela Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, said we will do it. People say that's the maximum, we could not welcome more refugees. At the end, there were 7 million refugees, Ukrainian, who were welcome in Europe. It was difficult, it asked organization, but also it was much better done than for other refugees, because they were agreed legal safety with rights, access to school, access to health system, and so on. So it shows that if there is a political will, we can do it, and we have to tell about the contribution of refugees, all refugees, not just those who came from Ukraine or the well-known intellectuals or artists, even if it's a very strong illustration. It's also interesting that in Transatlantic, at some point, Varian and his group, they decide that they will extend the action to more than just the list of people they came to save, who were the well-known artists that some others wanted to save from New York. So what do we learn from this in terms of storytelling, how we can more positively explain the contribution of refugees to our societies?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Transatlantic, I grew up in an America that was irrevocably impacted in a positive way by the very people that Varian helped to get out. But in the question of who, he went over with a list of people who were already famous and mostly middle-aged and old people, but all the young people haven't proven that's just raw potential, right? Like to select people for what they've achieved makes no sense, because he at a certain point he has a shift and he realizes, we just have to try and get everybody that we can. We have to try to do what we can with everybody. So I think there is that, that's part of the arc of his story. But if it, I always think, like, how can we bring people? I mean, the broccoli is chocolate. I love that. I think, how do we bring people into the story and make them recognize each other's humanity in the process? Because that's all we are. A refugee is just is a human being who's been displaced by political conflict. I mean, it's not. We're all the same, and I think the show tries to explore that.
Yes.
If I may, you made a point that I want to bridge on, that the refugees welcomed from Ukraine were given status that gave them education, access to education and work. And I think it's useful to realize that just from an economic standpoint, when we make that choice to welcome refugees into our education system and give them opportunities to work, they get to do what my grandfather did, which is become taxpayers and support the communities that they're in and thrive. And there's a bad PR out there about refugees that they've come to take. And I think that PR is sometimes very politically motivated, at least in the US, which is why I left. But there's an economic reality, which is that study after study has shown that when refugees are given an option, they get educated, they work, and they feed the economy of the country that's welcomed them. And so again, this is something we've learned with the Ukrainian population. Maybe we can migrate that to other populations as well.
Absolutely. I think the two scientists who developed the IRN COVID vaccine in Germany were coming from migration. Was there economic migrant refugees? Anyway, they were welcome in this country. And not only they pay taxes, but they created a vaccine that benefit to everyone. So I think now we can open to questions from the floor, from the public. I don't know if those following online can ask questions. Maybe it's only those in the room. And there is microphone which will be at your disposal. And please just raise your hand and we are here to answer.
Thank you so much to all of this panel. It's been really moving and inspiring to hear all of your words. And also thank you for making space for stories and compassion and, you know, the background and the beauty in this field. And you've mentioned that those that have the least often give the most, which again is beautiful and inspiring. But looking at the state of the affairs of the world, it's unfortunately not enough. So how also can I and can everyone here encourage and talk about this topic to those that have a lot, that could give more, without pointing fingers and without basing conversations on guilt and blame?
Right. Who wants to react and answer to this? Of course, you can support the IRC. The IRC is working in more than 35 countries in the world. Most of our staff are staff of the countries. You've been visiting many of our programs. So in Iraq, it will be Iraqi people and so on, but there is also, of course, international staff who come to support. And we are also welcoming refugees in some European countries, like Germany, for example, or the UK. We have programs to support the integration, school programs, learning programs, and so on. And also, we have a lot of these programs in the US, because it's a tradition since the Emergency Rescue Committee, and another group, which is also part of the creation of the IRC, which was created a little bit before, which was created on the request of Albert Einstein to welcome people who are fleeing the Nazi regime in 1933, fleeing from Germany and welcome in US places and cities. So there's many ways to commit yourself to support the IRC, but also as a citizen. And I don't know if you want to comment on this.
Sure. You know, it's such a good question, because reaching people is so challenging. And right now, I think there's a lot of compassion fatigue in the world, because it feels like the whole world is on fire. To me, I think part of the answer is through storytelling, and we can tell some of those stories. But also, not to be too cynical, but it is in people's best interest. It's in our own self-interest to support folks where they are. Again, study after study, the economics of it, the refugees always give more than they take. And when we look at it as an aggregate, whether it's supporting people in emergent situations so that they can then return home. I was speaking last night with a woman from Ukraine, and I said, well, you know, what's your plan? She said, I'm going home. I'm going to rebuild. And so this is a temporary solution for her life as a refugee, and it's one that builds goodwill and that builds global stability and bilateralism and peace. But also, if we don't address the crises as they emerge, then they become deeper and broader and more divisive crises. And I think it is a bit of a situation of a stitch in time saves nine. Not that someone's self-interest is the only way to appeal to them, but it can be effective.
Ralph?
I do not know how to answer that question, because I am a very passionate human being. I somehow lack patience when it comes to people not understanding what is something that could help all of us. But I know that if you show people that some refugees have become, I mean, some very famous people, very successful people have been refugees before, maybe that will help. That may, like maybe Albert Einstein, for instance, is a good example.
Freddie Mercury.
Exactly, yeah, yes. So maybe showing them, oh, you know, this person was actually a refugee. He needed help at some point. And look at what he did with the help that he got. So maybe that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that contact is a huge thing. You know, most people are afraid of what they don't actually understand. And if they haven't had any contact with anyone who, you know, has been displaced, if they've never been in a place where a crisis is happening, and you know, they don't have to travel very far to see it, right? It's happening everywhere. I think that the common humanity becomes very clear when people actually come into contact with one another. So that would be, to me, I think any way that can be can happen can improve the situation.
Yeah.
Thank you. I see another raised hand here.
Thank you very much for wise words. I wanted to ask you about a very common issue, which is the politicization of human rights. So many issues regarding human rights normally become politicized. For example, especially migration. We can see how that plays a big role in many elections and internal politics in different countries, the US, Europe. And it is, in my opinion, it's a bit sad because we're talking about humanitarian issues, about issues of human rights that shouldn't be politicized, because normally when they become political, that's when the support for solving the issue stops, or it becomes more difficult to solve these issues. So I would like to ask you, how do you think we could make these issues, especially migration, get out of the, be less political, and so that people could focus more on the humanitarian aspect of it? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. And it's true that, for example, European states are in principle committed to respect, in particular, the asylum rights, the Geneva Convention, and also for other migrants, a certain number of rights, which are now subject to a political confrontation in every country, where migrants, that's not new, but it's increasing, are like the anti-migrant speech is like the fuel of populism, scapegoats of every economic problem, even if at the same time, I mean, all studies are demonstrating the opposite, and that when you look at the demography of European countries, if you want to keep your economy functioning, if you just speak with the business people, if you speak with someone who have a restaurant or someone who has an agricultural exploitation, they will tell you that it's very difficult without migrants. And we have the same kind of discussion nowadays in France, where you have a discussion on a new legislation, and of course we can understand that state and nations wants to control the way people are accessing to their territory. But on the other side, you have all the business community who say we need to have a legal status for the migrants. So both from a realistic point of view, but also for the right one, especially for the refugees, because here it's not submitted to any other questions than the protection of people. We are very far from respecting our commitments. We see the disasters that it creates, for example, in the Mediterranean Sea, the people who just die because there's no safe pathways, there's no legal way. So one of the things we are advocating is that there should be a safe pathway, legal way to access to Europe, and that all European states should commit to this, because that's their international commitments, and that we have built Europe on the base of on legal basis, on principle and value basis, and that at least the democratic parties, they should not accept that these principles are part of a political fight, and that this become an easy way to win election, just playing on fears. But of course, it's again about the way we develop perception regarding refugees and migrants. And we don't say that it's exactly the same, all categories of people. But people suffering, people who have no other choice, we have first to help them in their country to face the situation of poverty, climate change, conflict, if we can help to resolve those. And when they have no choice than to ask protection, we have to recognize that all refugees have the same right, wherever they come from, and that protecting them is also not only helping them to rebuild their life, but also to prepare the future, including the future of their own country. Who wants to jump on this?
Listen, I have nothing of use to add. I'm an actor, but I think sometimes it comes down to the stories that we tell very early, very fundamentally. Everything has become so politicized right now, and I don't know that there's a quick way out of it, but I look at the stories that we start telling kids, And this may sound a bit odd, but we start with the idea that we are by nature competitive and by nature combative. And I think that's a lie. I think we were sold that story. I don't know where it started. Maybe it started with Darwin. I'm not sure. But there are any number of scientific studies and cultural studies that can be done that prove, like Suzanne Simard's book, Finding the Mother Tree, for instance, that demonstrate that deep in our nature is a profoundly collaborative, cooperative coding that's part of why we have been successful as a species. And I think if we start telling the stories to people very young and allow that to filter all the way up through our culture, it's going to take some time. This is all going to take time. None of this is going to happen quickly. And unfortunately, you know, turning the battleship of public opinion and of policy takes a lot of time. But I think as a storyteller, I see value in not saying to people, our nature is to compete with one another and to fight with one another, but instead to say our nature is to collaborate with one another and to reach out to one another, even at cost to ourselves, because the greater good then elevates everyone. Maybe that's a story that we can start working on a little bit.
Perhaps you want to?
I mean, it just brings us back to all being renegades and, and rejecting this idea.
I'm joining your revolution.
Thank you. Who else?
So there's other raised hand.
Maybe they're joining the revolution.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Excusez-moi.
Hello everyone.
Je partage également le panel avec des amis en Afrique.
I'm going to speak French. I'm here with some members of my delegation. My name is Guy Christian. I have a question regarding migration and refugees. Could you tell me more about the help you provide to those people in countries in a difficult situation? Because when we talk about migration or refugees, we tend to talk about African countries which are facing difficulties but who cannot go to Europe but would like to go to Europe for economic reasons, for instance. So do you provide help to civil society organizations or governmental organizations? This is important because if we were to stop coming to Western countries, we have to bear in mind that sometimes this is not possible. We may face issues linked to other situations. So what about the help? Is help given to some civil society organizations directly, or how does it happen? Well, thank you very much for this question. Well, we increasingly work with organizations from the civil society in those countries where we operate. For instance, in Western African countries. I don't know where your friends are specifically, but we work in different ways. We can provide some humanitarian assistance for food, to fight against hunger for children. We can also provide some education courses for children. And in those cases, we try to work hand in hand with governmental organizations, relevant organizations, for example, the Education Ministry or the Health Ministry, even though we provide the funding and we provide the experience that we have gained so far. But we always bear in mind that at some point we will have to transfer this action and pass it on to local stakeholders. Humanitarian assistance requires some time. We try to react swiftly when there there is a crisis. But very often refugees are displaced for over 20 years on average, and they end up in camps or outside the cities, in shanty towns. So we need to have a long-lasting presence, and we need to be embedded in the lives of the people. And increasingly, we try to support local stakeholders by giving them our expertise and our know-how and our funding. And we try and support them to make sure that they can actually implement the actions on the ground themselves. And this is something that we do, for example, in Niger, which is a transit country. Many migrants go through Niger to go up north towards Libya and the Mediterranean. And we work with many local associations, and we are present in Nigeria as well, as I said earlier. And we involve the entire humanitarian sector. This is increasingly important for IRC. Because it is important that once we leave, there is someone to take over from us to continue our actions, because we need to go from phase 1 to phase 2 to carry out these actions. But if we want this action to be relevant over time, we need to have a long-term vision. I think that this is the end of our session. Maybe we can take one last question. Yes, I can see a hand raised here.
Yeah, thank you for your time. Today we talked a bit about, or you talked about, the role of the government or state in, first of all, allowing refugees in, and also in essentially determining their quality of life with access to services that they are granted. And we also talked a bit about the Berlin example with the power of, civilian population in contributing to that as well. So I was wondering if you could give us an insight into the role of organizations such as yours in collaborating both with the government, but also maybe harnessing the power of civilian populations and what that looks like.
Yes, so that's more or less the same question, and I will share the answer with Anna, Ralph, and Sarah. So we are working also in Europe more and more with civil society organization, local organization. I will take, for example, the example of Germany, where we have been developing since 2016 and the Syrian refugee crisis, but also now with the arriving of Ukrainian refugees, program both of education. So this we do with the education system of the different landers to try to help the teachers to welcome Syrian refugees and now Ukrainian and other refugees, Afghans, in the school system. How you ensure that they will be able to integrate as smoothly and quickly as possible the normal school system. But you have to of course, ensure specific support for these children of migrants. And secondly, we are working with what is called, for example, the Migrant Council of Berlin or other civil society organizations, especially since the war in Ukraine, to ensure, for example, that third national who are living in Ukraine, so you had a lot of African students, for example, who were in Ukraine, or African workers or Middle East workers working in Ukraine. They don't benefit automatically from the temporary protection directive. It's more complicated for them. So we are advocating, we are supporting them, we are doing case management, and here we support local migrant and refugee German organizations to bring them the know-how or the funding so that they can do this work. So we try as much as we can not to work just alone. We bring our experience, our 90 years experience working in more than 35 countries in the world, but we try to cooperate as much as we can with other civil society groups and organizations and with the states when it's possible.
Yeah, and
Sarah.
Just very briefly, it's one of the things that I've always really appreciated about IRC, because there's a world in which certain kinds of aid can become a new form of imperialism, and people coming from outside to tell folks how to fix what's wrong. Everywhere I've been, there have been local groups that are grassroots organized, that IRC comes in and supports and connects with one another to improve communication among them. But that seems like a very, it seems like the right way to go about it. And I think, you know, receiving money from governments, receiving money from individuals, and then supporting those local groups on the ground seems to be working pretty well.
Yes, thank you, Sarah.
No, I didn't say that.
Anna, Ralph, no, if you want just to say a few words of conclusion.
Oh, you go first.
I go. Okay.
Sorry, I was listening.
Me too. I was talking to you earlier, actually, about joining the IRC, and I think I will do just that. So thank you so much for explaining what you do in detail, and yes, we'll talk more off stage without the witnesses. But yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
But you
Thank you very much, Ralph.
Please
join us.
That's because of Sarah, and he will become also an ambassador. Thanks a lot, Ralph. We are very honored. Anna.
Well, I mean, all I can say is, you know, having been last week at an event that at which the IRC, the people who work in the organization, talked about the work that they're doing all over the world, I was so impressed with all the different solutions and that it's solution-led. You know, that there's this sense of what you were saying earlier, that there's so many, sometimes it feels like the problems of the world are very overwhelming, and to hear about all the things people are doing on the ground to solve very specific problems is very inspiring. And I'm always thinking about how we can tell these stories, but I cannot believe no one's made a story yet about what people are actually doing in the field. And so that's what I'm thinking about. So anyway, thank you so much for having me. That's part of this conversation.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thanks to you, Ralph. Thanks, Sarah. It was great to have you. And please support refugees. Refugees are welcome. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you.